Okay, so I think slide 9 is where we finished. We're talking about the ability to exercise your religion mostly as you see fit, right? There are exceptions that require us to, or conditions and situations that require us to sometimes limit the exercise of religion. But anytime we can reasonably accommodate a religious practice, the general stance, at least from the Supreme Court, has been that we should. And if I remember correctly, we did talk about a little bit about the use of drugs in religious activities. We talked a little bit about sacrifice, right? Animal sacrifice as things that might or might not lead us beyond giving a reasonable accommodation or not. And so today we will pick up with talking about freedom of expression. So we've talked about the Establishment Clause. We talked about freedom of religious exercise of religion. So we're going to move now into just the freedom of expression. And this is huge, right? There's a lot going on here. This is the gist of the First Amendment to the Constitution, when people are generally saying, I have a right to free speech. This is what they're referring to. But it's a lot bigger than just speech. There's right more going on here than anywhere else in the Bill of Rights, because this first bit says Congress shall make no law, and then it had the religious bit, which we've already talked about. But the expression bit here, there's a lot going on. Right? Make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Make no law abridging the freedom of the press. Make no law abridging the right of people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So, right, you don't just have the right to get out and address what you think is going wrong with society. There's also the right to assemble as a group to help magnify that expression. And there's supposed to be the ability to address it directly toward government and expect, right, some kind of engagement for redress of grievances. On the outside, there's this other entity, the press, that, right, is supposed to be able to take all of this and assemble in a unified, coherent message and disseminate it. All of that and a little more, right, are what we're going to talk about in here. So there's a lot going on. So let's step through the pieces here, right? And we'll start off with the freedom of speech. So the first thing you have to understand is that freedom of speech is a very broad concept, right? It's not just what you say. It's not even just what you write. It is what you do. It is what you say, write, and do, right? So throughout the history of the court cases that deal with speech, we've come to understand speech to mean any communication meant to engage the political system or the government, right? So if you're delivering, right, remember at this free speech, one of the points of it, right, is, right, to petition the government for redress of grievances. So if you're doing any form of expression that is directed toward the government with an expectation that the government will hear that message, then it's free speech, right? And this is really broad. And so we'll look at some actions here. We'll look at some cases, but most of the time the courts have given us a pretty open interpretation of anything that's delivering a political message is probably free speech, and it would be protected by this liberty, right? Now, as you move beyond just delivering a political message, especially speech or writing, and move into action, those actions can carry impacts and results. And so at some point, what you do may translate into violations of other rights or liberties, which the government also has to protect. And so we're going to see, right, when the government does begin to decide whether it should limit some of this expression, it's doing it usually, and this is typically a true statement for most of the cases on limitations on action, is that they're trying to balance a freedom of expression with, especially if it's an action, some kind of impact on another right or freedom. And so the court is supposed to uphold both values, and they have to figure out a way to work through it. And so when we see a conflict of political values that come out of the Constitution or out of the amendments to the Constitution, that's when the court gets into some tough situations of trying to decide which is going to be right and which is going to be upheld. So if it's straight up people are speaking and they're writing and they're directing it toward their government, and there's little to no other things to consider, generally the courts are going to tell us this is good. This has to be protected. We need to allow this to happen. When it does get beyond that, right, they're going to look at the effect of the expression. They're going to look at the other values that are damaged if they allow the expression. Some of the ones that come up first and foremost are anything that's going to, any kind of freedom of expression that's going to bring a public order question in front of everybody. So if your freedom of expression is going to destroy or damage public order, is going to result in people being harmed, then the government's going to look at maybe limiting that expression. And in those cases, the courts are generally going to uphold limitations on that expression. In particular, right, we can look at the issue of obscenity as a place where actual speech, writing and words, and has been limited by the federal government and by state and local governments. And the argument is that obscenity, right, is something that causes harm to the public order, right, to the public arena, to the public in general. And as such, obscenity should not be a protected form of expression under the Freedom of Speech Clause. Libel is another one of those areas, right? So libel is when you're saying something that you know to be untrue. Libel is when you're writing it. Slander is when you're saying it. Both of those have the same results as far as the courts are concerned, whether it's libel or slander. It's going to be unprotected. So we can see from obscenity and libel and slander cases that there are limits to where the government is going to protect your freedom of expression. There are some lines that you can cross that will bring you right into this consideration as a lawbreaker, possibly. So let's look at it. When the government is trying to stop you from exercising your freedom of expression, most of the time they're going to be doing that on the back end of the situation. So you'll have already expressed yourself, and they're going to be looking at punishing you for violating those laws. In some cases, very few, they want to prevent you from actually expressing yourself. So this is referred to legally as prior restraint. So that's a prior restraint, right, to prevent your freedom of expression. Usually in the media, you're going to just see it referred to as censorship, right? You're not allowed to say, write these things. However, our general stance is that prior restraint or censorship is not allowed, right? Very few exceptions to this. We are going to generally default to the position, the courts have generally defaulted to the position that you say what you're going to say. If it violates, right, some public order or safety concern or something like that, then we will punish you on the back end, right? But we're not going to stop you from saying it on the front end. The big exception to prior restraint, right, the fact that we don't usually use censorship, right, from the government, is a national security issue, right? If you, right, are going to, what you're going to say or write is going to endanger people's lives from a national security perspective, the federal government especially is going to step in and exercise as much power as they can to try to keep you from doing that. So prior restraint is usually a no. Exception is almost always a national security thing. Now I have here a little blurb called Marchetti and Marchetti at the CIA. Marchetti and Marchetti were two CIA agents working for the federal government, right, had taken an oath to protect the Constitution and protect the country and to follow the laws. And after their careers, they decided they wanted to write a book about their CIA experiences, which in and of itself is perfectly fine. However, a good portion of what they engaged in was secret, top secret, could definitely impact national security. And they knew this. So as they were putting their book together, right, they told the CIA they were writing this book. Eventually, we want to get it published. We're going to do an advanced submission to you guys to read through it before anything goes out to anybody and tell us what is still subject to secret status and what's not, what can we publish, what is questionable. And they did. So they had this about 800-page book that they wrote, and they submitted it. The CIA turned it over to a judge that works right on national security issues and has national security clearance to review everything that the CIA had flagged as top security, to see if it was, as a disinterested third party, in the sense that the CIA was doing their job to protect national security. And then they did that, and the judge upheld almost everything that the CIA had flagged, and they handed the manuscript back to Marchetti and Marchetti, and they looked at it and they're like, wow, you exercised a lot of prior restraint on our book. And some of it they agreed with and some of it they didn't. And as ex-CIA officers, they were not predetermined to try to fight this and cause problems, because they knew they didn't know everything. So they accepted the results of the CIA and the judge. And they said, so much has been deemed still top secret. We really can't publish this book like this, right? Because there's and I've seen the book, right? And then there are like places where it's 5, 10, 15 pages that were extracted out, right? That were marked top secret. And so this is how they go about doing that restraint thing for folks that are engaged in it, in maybe possibly letting out things that might be considered top secret. What Marchetti and Marchetti did then that was remarkable was they got the publisher to go along with the idea of, let's publish this book and let's leave blank space in the book that's equivalent to everything that was taken out. So if they took out a paragraph, let's leave a blank space that's equal to the length of that paragraph. if they took out 10 pages, leave 10 blank pages. And they changed the focus of here's our experience in the CIA to here's how prior restraint works, and here's how it can impact publishing and freedom of expression. And they published that book, and so it's out there. And you can go look at it, right? And you'll be going along, and they'll just be blank pages, right? And most of the time, it's a sentence here or a couple words here. It's not like this is complete of blank pages, but they're taking names out, they're taking places and dates and things like that most of the time for security issues. But sometimes they're taking out whole pages and series of pages, and they publish that book like that. And so it was a really interesting kind of exercise, and here's what can happen. About 20 years later, they went back with their original manuscript to see if they could publish it now, right? After 20 years, how much of this is still going to be considered top secret? And a large portion of it, to the credit of the government, had been, right, they went back through it and they said, okay, this stuff that used to be is no longer top secret. These folks that we were protecting have passed on, don't have to worry about protecting them anymore. And so they republished their book, showing what had been top secret and what hadn't over that period. Now, interestingly enough, there was still some stuff in there that they the government exercised prior restraint with, and there's still some places where things are top secret. But it was a real interesting kind of example of how the process works. And in this case, because Marchetti understood, right, as what they had done in the past, a lot of it was going to be top secret. They were, they weren't suing the government in that sense, right? They were following through the process, a learning experience, and it stood out. And what we found from that, at least academics on the back end, is that when you examined what got added back in, and then you went back historically and looked at it, you're like, oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense that would have been sensitive information that the government wouldn't have wanted to let out back then. So prior restraint does happen, especially if it's going to be something that's national security related. And the process is interesting in that the federal government has judges that have the ability to be both exposed to the secret and determine whether or not it's still something the government needs to protect. So it brings in a somewhat disinterested third party that doesn't just let the CIA or the military or whoever say, no, that's too secret, we're not going to let it out, right? There's someone that comes in and tries to put a little bit of objectivity on it. Now, obviously, I think we all would understand that the judge is still going to be probably biased toward the government and toward protecting national security, but it's not a horrible approach to trying to work through this kind of concept of censorship and have it be exercised as little as possible. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about that idea of prior restraint? All right. So the next thing we want to kind of move to that's in this same area is that when it's not prior restraint, but it's when you as a publisher, a writer, a speaker should exercise some restraint on your own, because you may well be punished if you don't. So if you utter something, if you write something, right, and before you put that action into place that what putting out there as expression is knowingly untrue, then you're gonna probably be punished, right, for that in some sense. There are exceptions, a lot of exceptions, right? If you're right about who you're talking about or what you're actually saying, but knowingly untrue statements or expressions are not very well protected. So you've probably heard people say, look, you have a right to say what you want to say, but you're not going to be protected from, right, the fallout from it or the impact of it. And that's what we're talking about here, right? When you say something, when you write something, when you exercise your free speech, We're not going to stop it on the front end, but there are going to be some possible issues for you on the back end if they're not appropriate. So this is where we're starting stepping into looking at obscenity and libel and slander as an example for this. So we got our first real obscenity case, right? And in 1957 with Roth versus the U.S. And what Roth tells us is that there's some speech, there's some expression that is going to violate all civil norms in a sense, that violate all standards of a city or a state or the country. And we just cannot allow it. So those violations of norms are going to be bad for society as a whole. So what Roth told us, the case of Roth versus the U.S. told us, is that there is this non-protected speech or press called obscenity, which usually is going to be around violations of city values or state values or norms in relationship to generally sex, of course. So if something is obscene, by definition, it is unprotected expression. Now, most of us don't have a problem with that, right? Saying that there's some things out there that go so beyond that people just really shouldn't be allowed. They're causing harm when they say or write those things or film those things. The problem is, where is that line? When do we step over from something, a freedom of expression, being insulting or degrading or just unappreciated to becoming obscene? Where do we step over from most people don't like this to we're going to punish you because it goes to a certain spot? And that is a line that has never been well drawn by the courts. And the reason is it's almost impossible, right? To decide what is obscene. It varies so much from person to person, to city to city, to state, that there's just really no way for us to tease out a definition or bright line that we can lay out there that works. What if you go into, say, Liberty Hill or Fredericksburg or something, right? What's obscene there, right? What would violate all community standards and have everybody up in arms there is not going to, right, impact anybody probably in New York City, right, or California, right, especially in a big urban area, right? We have different sets of values based on where we are and who we are and where we live, and so we're not going to get an easy agreement on what's obscene and what's not, and the courts have not been able to give that to us as well. So Roth tells us that if something is obscene, it's not protected expression. So I'm going to give you a couple of cases here where the courts are trying to draw this line or give us this definition so that the courts below them, right, can have some kind of semblance of continuity and here's what this means. Here's what the law stands for. So the first place to look is a court case called Miller versus California. Notice this is what 73. So we're looking at what 16 years later or something. So after Roth, and so what California, the court case in California that went up to the Supreme Court, what it said was the Supreme Court looked at it and they worked their way through and said, obscenity is when you look at a work, an expression as a whole, right? And the whole work taken as a whole appeals to a prurient interest in sex, which means a little different, right, salacious, over the top. A prurient interest in sex is one element of it. it shows patently offensive sexual contact, and 3, it lacks a serious artistic, literary, political, or scientific merit. This was the kind of 3-step application that came out of the court to try to define expression as obscene. And if it didn't meet this criteria, then it wasn't obscene. It was going to be protected. If it did meet this criteria, then it was obscene and you could be punished for it. The idea here was that they were giving something down to the states, down to the cities that they could apply, right, as a legal principle to try to make this consistent. And so you look at this list, right? First one taken as a whole, 2, patently offensive contact. And the third one is prefaced by the word and. Now, if you've ever had any kind of sentence diagramming work or any kind of logic work, that 3-letter word there at the beginning of the third phrase is incredibly important because it tells you that all 3 of these have to be true. 1, taken as a whole, has to be true. 2, the patently offensive contact has to be true. And, right, so 1 and 2 and 3, it has to lack serious artistic. So when they gave this list, and you know, judges are if not careful about the words they choose, right? They put and in here. It didn't say this or this or this. It said this, this, and this. So all 3 of these have to be true from the Supreme Court's perspective for something to be labeled obscene and therefore not allowed or punished after the fact. And so this was the guidelines that were supposed to go into place. Now, if you're thinking about this, right, they're trying real hard here to come up with something, right? If the work as a whole is focused on sex and it's focused on patently offensive sexual contact, right? The contact's important because, right, it's not just words in that sense. It's, there's contact, right? Then we're gonna, right, we think we might be close to saying this could be something we don't want out there. And then obviously this third one was, wait a minute, there's a whole lot of stuff out there that's considered art that we have to maybe carve out an area for, right? And so that's where this last clause comes in. And they thought, okay, this is probably the best we can do, putting out a nationwide standard for the lower courts to work with. So this is what came out in 1973. The purveyors of smut and filth looked at this and went, perfect. Now we know exactly how to make sure our work is never defined as obscene. All we have to do is, in whatever expression we're putting out there, make sure it has some serious artistic, literary, political, or scientific merit. And if it does, it cannot be defined as obscene. There's a book out there called The Brethren, which is a 10-year, 15-year kind of write-up of the Supreme Court and what was going on during the Warren era during that time, which is the courts making a lot of big decisions on First Amendment cases, on Fourth Amendment cases. And they have excerpts of discussions from the judges. And the judges said that at the Supreme Court level, that after they issued this opinion the next year, the evidence that started coming back in as a result of this was that all of these, especially film producers, would put in a scene, generally at the beginning of a film or something. They said they'd put a scene in that would be like in a classroom. And you'd have an English teacher up there talking about literary merit in this novel, or a scientist up there talking about science. And the idea was, of course, is that if they put in 30 seconds or a minute of serious right, artistic, literary, political, or scientific merit. Whatever came after that didn't matter. And so you had a lot of these X-rated films starting off in a classroom setting where, this is happening, so that they could outfox, right, the idea of their stuff being to be obscene. So that was the idea here, right, is that these guidelines would do this, and then what they ended up doing is, and figured out, the more we get detailed in what we try to define as obscene, the more we're actually given, right, a roadmap to folks to, right, ensure that their stuff isn't. And while it's not necessarily a bad thing, it requires a lot more work to be effective. So despite the fact that most of us agree obscenity is something that goes beyond the norm and probably shouldn't be protected as expression, although there are some who say, right, libertarians especially, like, no, nothing you can say could ever be obscene. All you're doing is saying you don't like it. Well, fine. You don't like it, don't look at it, don't read it, don't whatever, right? But there's no way it could be obscene, right? And there were Supreme Court justices that had that position, that believed obscenity was just simply a misalignment between individual values and community values, and that a person shouldn't be punished for that. To the point where when cases would come to the Supreme Court, there was especially William Douglas, one of the preeminent champions of freedom of expression, wouldn't even bother to look at the evidence because he didn't need it. Right? His belief is constitutionally there is no such thing as obscenity. It's just a disagreement, and it's not the court's job to choose a value that's going to be a social value to be protected at another level. And so for him, right, if evidence would come in, right, a film or the book or whatever, he never even looked at it because his position was didn't matter what was there, it can't be, right, it's an expression that cannot be limited. So there's a lot of interesting perspective and tension between the folks trying to make these decisions. So Miller versus California is just an example of the court trying to figure out how to make obscenity something we can understand, put a definition to it that works, and how it actually backfired on them completely. And we're still left with, right, today, a very difficult situation of trying to square up community values with individual values or state values. And so again, anytime you're going to have a conflict between someone's freedom of expression and maybe protecting other people from an extreme expression that could be considered harmful, especially, right, this carries a little bit of weight when you start thinking about what's available for minors to see, right? You've got some current concern there. So that's a kind of a quick jump through some of the obscenity issues that and problems that we see with trying to make that a limitation on freedom of expression. I want to move on to libel and slander now, as another place where you can see the court trying to let people say as much as possible, but trying to find some kind of line that they can draw in the sand that if you go past here, your freedom of expression is going to be impacted, and you as not on the censorship side, but on the punishment side after having done it, right? Because prior restraint, again, is very seldom what we want to do. So defamation is the overarching term for saying having untrue things said or written about you. Legally, we have libel, which is the publication of statements known to be false, and slander, which is the spoken right defamation. In other words, you have said something that you know to be false, usually about somebody or a company or something like that. And the big idea here is that both of these, defamation as a whole, both libel and slander, are not the types of speech that we want to generally afford freedom of expression protections to, right? We don't want to write something in law that says you can go lying about people and never have to worry about the impact of your words coming back and you being held responsible for them. However, Um, that last part of the freedom of expression clause is telling us, hey, we need to protect this idea of expression because it's what allows us to hold the government accountable and to try to get the government to change and to get them right focused on us. And so any expression that's going towards that really needs to be protected. So the court's drawn a distinction between the target of freedom of expression. If you are libel or slandering a private individual, there are civil court consequences, civil law consequences that can be brought back to you. If you're saying something that you know to be untrue, you're writing something you know to be untrue about your next door neighbor, who is just, somebody that's working in society, you can be held responsible for that, right? You can be punished for that. Is that the court case, Colton, that is, or one of them that talks about the Sandman versus CNN? Thank you. I appreciate that. You can be held responsible, right? On the other side of it, though, they're wanting you to understand that anybody that's a public official that's in government is going to get a little different standard than a private citizen. And Sullivan, New York Times versus Sullivan, right, from '64, good ways back, is telling us this, right? You can write things that are untrue. You can say things that are untrue, especially if you believe them, right? That helps a little bit, right? About public officials. But our desire to protect speech directed at the government, we're not going to punish you for something that's untrue if you did not intend it to cause harm. So if you believed it, you thought the government was doing something wrong, and you were incorrect, so what you're saying is untrue, you got some leeway there, right? But if you're saying something about a public official that's both known to be untrue and intended to cause harm, then we're going to take a look at this, right? Then maybe you'll be subject to libel or slander penalties. And I ask here, right, and normally in the classroom, I would have some discussion on this, why this is the case. But it's generally apparent that once you step into government, you're no longer a private individual, and your protections go with it for several reasons. One, you're part of government. We got to let people talk about government if our freedom of expression clause is going to mean anything. That's the primary focus for it, is to address the government and officials in government and what they're doing and what they're saying. So, right, when I was working for the state, I would make decisions, and those decisions would have impacts on people, private individuals. They had the right to go in public and say, "Hey, this dude's doing bad stuff, and here's why it's a bad thing, and they ought to be stopped from doing this." And in that case, a lot of times they didn't understand, and they were saying things that were untrue about me and my decisions. Too bad, right? I'm in government. I get some protections as a government official for doing things in my official position, but I also get subject to some things too, right? Which is, maybe some things being said uncomfortably or written about you that are uncomfortable. You just have to deal with it. So one, that going into it, that you're going to be subject to discussion, debate, writing that you may not want to have happen, but you got to get comfortable with. The second thing, though, is that when you're in government, you've got the tool of government to use to deliver your message, to address these things that are untrue and are damaging or whatever. And so you've got a platform to speak from, to set the record straight, that might be a lot more expansive and have a lot more impact than what a private citizen would have. So in a real sense, especially for elected individuals, they probably don't need, right, the government looking out for them and providing them with protections from untrue statements, right? They can stand out there and battle on their own. And I like to look at our current situation with our current president as an example of this, right? If people in the press or otherwise are saying things untrue about President Trump, does he have the ability in the media to defend himself, and does he use it? Absolutely, right? Twitter account of the president, right? What has never been a powerful media tool before is now, right? And he's got millions upon millions of folks that pay attention to his Twitter account, which gives him, because he has that huge Twitter account for a couple of reasons. One, he was a media personality. He'd been engaged in politics as well as his TV show, but and now he's president, and so what he says matters, and so that Twitter account carries weight. And if somebody's saying something against the president and he thinks it's utterly untrue and is causing him harm and needs to be addressed, he can get a message out to millions and millions of people in a matter of seconds. And if the Twitter account's not enough, he can call a press conference and spread it even further, right, through the media. So that's what the courts are looking at here when they say that, those in office probably don't need protection for their status or their integrity or something like that, because they have the ability to directly address it and come back and say, hey, that's not true, and it's not true, and here's why, and shows, right, and that message can get out. And that's not always true for private citizens, and so there are some protections in place for them when something is knowingly said or written that's untrue. In the case of the public official, it has to be not only that, but it also has to intend to cause harm. And that gets a little squishy there in figuring out what the harm is and what it means. And I don't have anything to go into a lot of depth on that, but so right, we've got different standards based upon who the target of the defamation is. Any questions along that line? Right. One thing to kind of keep in mind too is you've probably seen celebrities suing. I don't know what the right term for those publications are, right? Gossip magazines or gossip papers or whatever. You see them sue them, right? And in civil court, and they're suing them for them to retract what they said or to publish something true or for loss of money or all of that. And of course they're under that lower standard, right? They're not an official of government. So if they prove that the gossip magazine or whatever knew something was untrue before they published it, then they lose that protection, and they're going to be open to civil penalties and fines. And so that's how that kind of works to help. I would imagine that there's a little bit more leeway when you're talking about public personalities versus private people, but the standard is still close to the same. It's when you cross over to being a part of government as a public official that the intended to cause harm bit gets added on there. Any questions about that? Before I move on to symbolic speech. Okay, so yes, Lauren, I mean, it has to be teased out in court. So the person bringing the question she has is, so the harm part of against a private of speech that's known to be untrue against and causes harm, right, against a public official. That public official is given the extra burden of showing what the harm is, and so it has to be not only known to be untrue, but to have caused harm. So they have to say, this harmed me. In other words, my position was, I was not able to protect myself from this. And here's the harm that, right, I suffered because of it. So it can't just be, I didn't like what was said about me. It's going to have to be something at a higher level than that. And we're usually looking at damage to the family's reputation, damage to a business interest, damage, something that you can point at and kind of prove. So it is going to be open to some interpretation over whether that's harm that a public official should have been able to address. I mean, some issue as far as expression they should have been able to address, or whether it went beyond that and caused them something that was irreparable, something that they lost because of that, right? So one of the things that fit into that area is where so much pressure is being brought upon a public official that, and maybe threats, right, which goes into a different element of freedom of expression, but the harm element is what we're pointing at here, where someone said maybe doesn't have a direct threat against their life or their family's lives, but the culmination of it, the totality of it, makes them think that, okay, I'm in danger now, like from physical harm. And if that can be shown to be a persistent and kind of real interpretation of what was going on, and that they had to move or they had to hire security, then that's getting to the level where the courts can say, yeah, even as a public official, this was something that we've got to hold this expression, right, liable for its impact. Now, with someone with the president, right, as long as you're not making a direct threat upon their life, right, they're given enough security and surrounding that there's not much you can. But if you were to do something like hypothetically that you were going to harm, right, the president or their family or something like that, you're going to get visited by the government, right? Someone's going to come knocking on your door to talk to you if they find out about it, and you will be, if it's confirmed and you're actually meaning it, you'll be subject to penalties, right? Okay, so let's. Does that kind of get you where you need to go, Lauren, on that? Okay, let's talk about symbolic speech then for a little bit. With obscenity and with libel and slander, we're talking about expressions that you can point to, right, a book or a film or a speech, right, that's delivering a message in a sense that's easily discernible as a message. Symbolic speech is trying to corral actions that need to be protected, like political speech is, right, where you're directing it at your government. So you're trying to look at action and say, is this carrying a political message to the government? And the government, again, local, state, federal, right, county, school district, whatever all of those would be subject to this kind of perspective. So is there a political message here? Is there something in the action that delivers the message? If there is, then that action should be given most, if not the same protections as writing an article or book or putting out a video or speech or something like that, right? So this is where we're starting to see that ability to assemble and to protest getting protections, because those are, right, physical actions of symbolic speech, of freedom of expression. And so we've had numerous cases about individual expressions that have been tested in the courts, whether it be hand symbols, or as I have here on the slide, burning the flag or wearing a black armband. Any of these, there's been a whole host of actions that have been meant and have been understood to carry a political meaning. And when they do, they're generally going to be protected expressions. And so the flag, right? I mean, we've got federal code that tells us how we're supposed to treat the flag, and it's a violation of right, how we care for the flag, treat it in certain ways, including burning it, wearing it as clothing, or all these things. These are all violations, ones that can carry civil penalties to them, right? And in some cases, maybe even criminal penalties. When they're brought before the court over and over and over again, they're looking behind that treatment to the flag to see what the point was. Were they burning the flag to send a message? Were they wearing that flag to send a message? If they were, political message, then that's something we got to allow to have happen. I mean, the flag's an important symbol, right? It's the symbol of the country as a whole. It's the one thing that we can all hold up and say, our country, right, represented by this thing. But if what the action is detrimental to the integrity of that flag, is destroying that flag, we kind of want to protect it. But what better way symbolically to deliver a message that you're unhappy with what the government's doing than to express that through the symbol that's for that whole government, right? And that's what the courts have kind of looked at again and again, is that, hey, yes, all right, if you're retiring a flag in a proper way, burning is a way to do that. If you're burning a flag in public, that's highly divisive and it makes people mad. And a lot of people don't want that to happen. However, does it deliver a message that you're not happy with what the government's doing? Yeah, it's real clear in a lot of instances, right? That's why it makes people mad, right? I remember sitting and watching the news, right, with my family and watching protests against the U.S. happening in other countries, right? And routinely, right, they're setting an American flag on fire, they're throwing it on the ground, they're stepping all over it, and, right, we don't like that. Well, is that sending a political message to us about how they feel about what our government's doing in their country or their people? Yes. Now, we may still agree that our policy and our practice of what our government's doing is appropriate and right, but right, we feel that message. So that symbolic speech works, right? It delivers that message as much as we may not like it. So the courts have recognized that as a form of speech to be protected, because we can't just say you have to write it down, or we can't just say it has to be delivered in a speech, right? We've got the freedom to assemble in here as well, or to come together as a group to deliver a message of import to the government, and that is one. And so they've said, look, we may not like it, but that's kind of the point. And it does deliver the message, so we need to allow that to happen. The flag on the seat of the pants one is one of my favorite ones. This happened in Dallas courthouse. An individual was protesting the court case that was being decided in that courtroom, and sewed the flag on the seat of their pants, and then went into the courtroom, right, where all law enforcement, judicial officers, people that are working for the government, and then sat down in the courtroom, and was promptly arrested by officers in the Dallas area, and was going to be punished, right, sentenced and punished for desecrating the flag. And it got to the court, and the court's like, is there any clearer message that this person was protesting what was going on in that courtroom? And that's directed right at the government. And so, as much as no one involved except the person wearing the pants wanted to say you had to let this, that's what the court did, right? So again, if there's a message there, a political message there to be delivered, especially if it's just offending our sensibilities, the courts have tended to say, tough, get over it, right? You may not like the message you're hearing, but that doesn't matter. So you've got to listen to those messages. Right now, right, we've got messages going out about racism and about how systemic racism exists and how we're treating people of color. And the message is sometimes delivered in ways that's offensive to other people. The offensiveness is going to be protected. Once that action crosses the line from delivering a political message to destroying property or taking property away from other people, then right we've got some issues there. Is it still delivering a political message? Probably, but it's also gone beyond the message at that point, right? And it's violating some other things that the government is supposed to be able to protect citizens against, like violence and destruction of property. And the government's put into a position of how much weight do we give each side of this issue? We're supposed to protect the symbolic speech here that the protest is showing, and we're also supposed to protect property. And where do we draw the line there? And is it any property? Is it a certain level of property? Is physical safety is almost always an immediate where it's going to harm a person. Property is a little, right? We've got people that say, look, that property is mine. They got no reason to be taking property from me, and the government should protect me. There's no latitude there. And then there's other right saying, well, sometimes right, you got to let the protest happen, and while we don't want to condone the violence, those things get out of control. And so we know damage is going to happen. Our job is to limit it as much as we can while letting as much of the voice be expressed as possible. It's a tough balance. It puts city governments, police officers, federal officers in a tough position because you've got two values here that are both very important. And at some point, right, they're enforcing one's going to hurt the other, regardless of which one you enforce. And so the government's put in a no-win situation there, and we're trying to walk through that situation and get to a better solution. Generally speaking, if your expression, right, is carrying political meaning, we're going to go as far as we can to try to protect that. What about Confederate flags? It seems unconstitutional. Well, what seems unconstitutional about it, I guess, is where I'd have to start with that. It's certainly, right, divisive, right, in the sense that it carries a divisive message that if you're arguably carrying a divisive message, right, what are the two messages, at least two messages, or probably more, that flying a Confederate flag brings with it? One, right, that's a flag of a country, right, that was in a war and attacked the U.S., and there's lots of lives lost in that war, right? And so when you fly that flag, are you, right, flying a flag of a traitorous section of our country that seceded and built its own country and then engaged in war? Is that okay? So what's unconstitutional though about sending that message out there? If you're sending that message as we should reconstitute the Confederacy and overthrow the U.S. government, then that's a problem. If you're sending it out there as a message of group identity, of bringing some kind of cultural perspective together, I'm not sure that that's going to be considered unconstitutional, right? It will certainly be a minority position, but that doesn't make it unconstitutional. Is it delivering a message to the current government? that's where we got to ask that, because if it is, if the flying of a Confederate flag delivers a political message to the governments that are in place, right, whether state local all the way up, then it's probably protected speech, right? But if it's not delivering a message, then we have to look at it, right? A political message. Unconstitutional, probably never, right? It'd be hard to probably make that argument. Now, if it were being used as a symbol for an armed uprising, then you'd have something, right? If it's the symbol to say, hey, let's secede legally, not unconstitutional. So I don't know. It's certainly divisive. It certainly offends a lot of people. And then a lot of people, right, hug it as important to their culture, their heritage, or perspective. I think that's generally not a strong argument from my perspective, but I can't tell somebody else that they can't feel that way, right? However, do we need to ensure that government, right, embraces that message? I don't know that we need to say that the state governments have to fly that flag or not fly that flag. I think that's more of a choice situation. Be interesting to see where that goes over time. I don't know. It's a tough one. Do you have some concerns with that I didn't address, or something that you think ought to be teased out a little more there? I find it interesting. Lauren, I'm looking at your last one there, right, about is this unconstitutional? And then 2 lines up, looking at harm. And so, if we were to accept a perspective of harm, does the flying of this flag cause harm? Or does the prevention of the flying of this flag cause harm? Would be an interesting perspective to start looking at it. And in a real sense, the answer from a speech perspective is it probably doesn't. It upsets people, but that's all political speech has that potential. And courts have again and again interpreted this freedom of expression to allow, right, expression that people will be uncomfortable with, and to protect it, right? So let me back up just a little bit. Lived in Mississippi, the Confederate flag flew under the state flag. Not only that, but didn't Mississippi have part of the Confederate flag in its state flag? I thought so, yes. And that delivers a message for a lot of folks that's not a healthy message, not a good message, right? Yeah, exactly. And that's where we're going with this. So is it harm to the point that we need to prevent it? Anybody from being able to say it? Just because it makes you angry, and it's made especially people of color angry for 160 years now, more than that, understandably so. Should we prevent it? And let's assume, no, absolutely not just African Americans, but I think there are very few African Americans that haven't been offended. Well, I wouldn't say everyone. There are quite a few people that embrace that message, especially in the South, and don't get. Not only do they not get angry about it, they, right. Yeah, we're going to get into a tough discussion with racist and non-racist. I've had this discussion, right? Folks that embrace the Confederate flag, some of them are open racist and admit it, but most of them are holding this cultural heritage argument. And I have a hard time buying it, but they're calling someone a racist and proving they're a racist is hard. right? And I think we have to be careful when we label people racist without knowing where they're coming from. They're racist from your perspective. You're feeling that racism. It's impacting you as racism, and that's real to you. And in that sense, you're going to be reacting to it as racism, and I think that's appropriate. Um, do they have a standard, and can we, or should we be enforcing a standard where they have to look after your feelings, right? Um, and do we want to try to prevent them with some kind of political power from feeling the way they feel about that? Even let's assume it is racist. Let's just take that off the table and say, I'll give you an example. The Ku Klux Klan, an admittedly racist organization, is alive and well in the United States. Right? They have organization, they have meetings, people join it, they have marches, right? They organize these marches and they want to get their message out just the same way as a lot of other what we would refer to as hate groups do. And let me come back to that, Melante, because there's a dual issue there that's important that we tease out. So when I don't guess I've told you, I got my degree, my advanced degree from Texas A&M. And I was there when the KKK wanted to march in College Station, Texas. And they went to the city council and they filled out the paperwork saying, we want to have a protest march and we want to go down Texas Avenue, which is right in front of the Texas A&M campus on a Saturday morning, and express our views and have a march. And the city council, right, looking at everything is that they're supposed to do for protest and allowing marches, right, looked at all that, said, okay, here's your permit, right? You get to march. You get to put your message out there. Is it a message of intolerance? Certainly. Is it a message of hate? Probably. Are we going to let you do it? Yes. Not only are we going to let you do it, but we're going to provide police protection so that you can do it safely. We're going to close the streets down. We're actually going to assist you to deliver this message, even though I would hazard a guess that nobody on the city council really thought that was what they wanted to do. But we believe that allowing people to deliver their political messages, especially in a form of action or protest or speech, even if we don't like it, is important enough that we have to let them say those things. It's really not a functioning democracy if you don't let the minorities, and I'm talking here about voting minorities, right, have an opportunity in public to say what they believe they need to say, even if you, right, really to the core you're being disagree with it. And so that's what's behind this freedom of expression, is that if our democracy is going to hold any meaning, we've got to let all of the adverse messages out there that don't rise up to a level of sedition and traitor, being a traitor. So they let them march, right? And of course, what the KKK was thinking was, here's this conservative university in rural part of Texas, and this is going to be an opportunity for us to grow our membership and get our message in front of people that might be receptive, and it's going to be a good thing for us. And even if it wasn't, they were expecting, right, those politically interested kids at the school to show up and protest them. Right. Worst case scenario is the college shows up and protests them, and that makes a big thing on the news, and they get news coverage, and that's good. And of course, Texas A&M is sitting there looking at all this, going, "This is not the kind of thing we want happening, certainly on our campus, and certainly not right in front of campus." Right? Texas A&M as a whole gets nothing but a black eye for this. But just like City College Station, there's nothing legally that they could do here to stop the march. So they did something different, and I thought it was just a masterful stroke of understanding how these things work. They said, well, what could we do that would encourage people not to even show up, to not even let their message reach people, really? And what the college did, the university did, was they organized basically a festival, music festival, free musics and things on the other side of campus, which if you know A&M, it's a very large campus, at the same time. And college students were like, let's go to the party, right? And so you've got a group of 15 or 20 some odd folks marching up Texas Avenue, and the only people that are there watching them are their own supporters and a few of the media personnel, but nobody else. And that's how you deal with a divisive message, right? Something like that. So yeah, I thought it was right. I thought that's the way you do that, because it made them deliver. I mean, they got their opportunity to say what they wanted to say, right? They wanted to march, they let them march, but they didn't let them, in a sense, facilitate that message easily to a bunch of people. So some good thinking can go on sometimes that does all of this, lets people speak the way they need to, feel they need to, and maybe diffuses the situation as they do it. So we'll talk a little more about this when we get to time, place, and manner restrictions later on that have to do with protests. So, but I want to come back up here to your Black Panther example, because that's a really interesting one, and it's interesting because it actually brings together a couple things, right? Black Panthers, right? Black-oriented protest group, also bringing with it large elements of civil and social development for blacks at that time. Right? They weren't just about sending out a single political message. They're also about changing the communities that they were in. So they had both a civil message of here's what we're going to do in our society, and here's the message that we're going to send out. The threat part of it is they also embraced the Second Amendment, right? And so if you're a white supremacist, one of the scary things you can probably see is black people, right, in public following the state laws about carrying their guns in public. And the Black Panthers did that. And there were certain elements of the Black Panthers that embraced violence to bring about change as well, and that also makes them a threat. Now, obviously, at the point where you transition over from the message to the violence, that can be a scary thing, and that is going to get the government involved, as any group is. It's going to bring violence into the situation. But right up until that point, right, are they delivering a political message? Absolutely, absolutely they are, right, and that's got to be protected as well. So just the same as we see gun rights activists, and quite often we see this here in Austin, right down on the Capitol lawn with their long rifles slung over their shoulders and stuff. The Black Panthers used that same strategy and same perspective to deliver their message too. And at that point, right, that's all well and good, and we've got to protect that just like we protect, right, the right for the KKK to protest and march with their message. I'm sure that there are a lot of people that were unhappy with the Black Panther message, just like they're unhappy with the KKK message. And guess what? As long as it's peaceful and done in the right, delivering a political message, the government's job is to see that it can happen, to allow that action to carry that expression and to carry that speech. And so we're seeing a lot of that today, right? As we see BLM, Black Lives Matter, and we see I don't know what to call the other side of it. Some Proud Boys, some white nationalists, some right-wing militants, right? Maybe new Confederalists. Yeah, I haven't heard that term, but right. So there's a lot there, right, that's going on, and those two groups, when they come into close proximity to one another, that's pretty volatile, right? Um, yes, the KKK has a very long history of violence. They also have a very long history of being involved in and running government while they were encouraging violence in society as well. So if you go back far enough, we had I can't remember his name. We had a Supreme Court justice who earlier in his life had been a part of the KKK, and when he was talking about it, it's like, look, if you were going to get ahead as a lawyer or a politician or a businessman in the city I grew up in, that was like not the better business, that was like the Rotary Club that had this other really horrible thing that they were doing at night. And he's like, later I put all that together and I stopped. But yeah, right. So the KKK permeated Southern societies, a lot of them, for a long period of time, not just on the scary violent side, but also on the running government side of things. And those members that were doing both of that were not going to be bringing across a message that looked out for everybody in society. That's for sure. Um, so um, I have exhausted my time already, haven't I?